Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 9th of June of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. As you can see, we have significant number of icons from Belgrade area, so let's talk about them. First, let's talk about Gluboko direction. The Russian sources reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians made more attempts to attack the village, but most of those attacks were repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians suffered losses and were forced to fall back. So if summarize everything that happened during the previous few days, that was the second attempt to attack from the Ukrainian side, and for now those two attacks were repelled by the Russians. We don't have any videos or geolocations confirming that. Now let's move to Kupyansk. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians were trying to improve their positions further to the southeast from Kupyansk, and as a result of those attacks, the Russians captured some tree lines, some positions of the armed forces of Ukraine in this direction, yet we don't have any geolocation confirming this. I'll just remind you that during the previous 48 hours, this is the second report in a row confirming or reporting the same thing. Now let's move further to Vovchansk. We have additional updates and we have completely opposite updates from Ukrainian and from the Russian side. When talking about the Russian reports, they continue storming and they continue attack in direction of Vovchansk aggregatny plant, and according to the Russians, they managed to establish additional control over a few more buildings in the area. As for Ukrainians, they were counterattacking the Russian forces, let's say in the vicinity of the Central Park, yet neither the Russian attack nor the Ukrainian attack have any let's say geolocated confirmation. From this direction we have just two geolocations that confirm, let's say, more or less the positions of the armed forces of Russian Federation and Ukraine. For example, along Zernovaya Street we can see the video that was published by the Ukrainians, and we can see on this video the movement of Ukrainian soldier who was moving from one side of the street to another, and this video confirms that this territory is under complete Ukraine control. Of course, this street is very far from the line of combat contact, so we had no doubts whether this street was under Ukraine control or not, but anyway, just the geolocation confirming the presence of the Ukrainians there. And as in the case of the northern part of Vovchansk, we also have the video published by the Ukrainian sources, and on this video we can see the movement of Russian infantry in direction of this part, and after that the Ukrainians started bombing and attacking the Russians. This video also confirms that this territory completely under Russian control. So as you can see, no changes on the ground, nothing on the ground, but significant number of reports that Ukrainians continue their counter-offensive operation, and today we got more updates and more evidence about Ukraine counterattacks. And the most important is that the Russians destroyed the dam. Once again they destroyed the dam. I'll remind you that on the 10th of May, almost a month ago, the Russians already destroyed the dam. We have the video and we have geolocated video confirming this. Let's take a look at this video once again. This video was received on the 11th of, let's say, May, so almost a month ago, but later, probably somewhere in the 20th of May, we got more details, more updates that Ukrainians managed to repair the bridge. So that's why somewhere from the 20th of May, the Ukrainians started using the bridge once again, and we had the question why the Russians didn't destroy this bridge before. And the answer is very simple, because the Russians knew that Ukrainians sooner or later would start their offensive operation, so that's why the Russians were keeping the bridge almost until the beginning of this operation. And as we discussed, the Ukrainian counter-offensive started a few days ago, so that's why the Russians destroyed the bridge exactly at the time when the Ukrainians began their counter-offensive. Also, we don't have any geolocations confirming that the Russians destroyed the bridge. The only thing we have is the report from the northern group of forces and from the military mayor, or the head of military administration of Kharkiv, Sinigubov. He reported today that the bridge was destroyed and now the Ukrainians suffer some logistic problems. Furthermore, we got some pictures of how the Russians were destroying the Ukrainian positions, temporary positions, concentration of forces. On these photos we can see the results of strikes in the village by the name of Bely Kolodys with the use by the Russians of Ha-38 missile. Furthermore, we have some, let's say, pictures of results of Russian attack in the village by the name of Khatomля. Now let's talk about Ukrainians, what new the Ukrainians started today. We got very interesting articles that the Western sources started publishing today. According to the Western, let's say, newspapers, Ukrainian warplanes fires weapon at target inside Russia for the first time. You know that the Ukrainians were using Storm Shadows and Scalp missiles in the previous phases of the special military operation, but the Ukrainians were attacking, let's call it, new Russian territories that the Western countries considers as the territory of Ukraine. We're talking about Lugansk People Republic, Donetsk People Republic, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Crimea. The Ukrainians were attacking these territories with warplanes, with jets, since the beginning of the special military operation. But today, according to the official statements of different, let's say, Western medias, the Ukrainians, let's say, attacked the old Russian territory for the first time. And probably the Ukrainians were attacking the area in the vicinity of the village by the name of Centralne. The Ukrainian sources published the video of results of one of those attacks. On this video, we can see the building that was set on fire, and according to, let's say, locals, according to the people on the ground, there were, let's say, secondary detonations. Some sources are saying that the Ukrainians managed to destroy some headquarters. Other sources are saying that the Ukrainians destroyed ammo depot or some warehouse. So this is the first case. Most likely the Ukrainians are going to use more and more attempts to attack the territory of old Russia with Western weapon, and this is another evidence that something big, something huge is going to happen on this direction in the very near future. Maybe already these things start happening. Now let's move to the north in Kupyansk direction. We have additional updates from this territory as well. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians continue attempts to attack Stepovo-Novosilovka from the northeast and from the north. Those attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians. They sent significant number of FPV drones. The Ukrainians were operating with the forces of 43rd Mechanized Brigade, their drone, let's say, operators, and as a result of FPV droning, some Russian tanks were damaged and destroyed, including personnel carriers. Also, the Russians were trying to attack the Ukrainians along the railways on the line Kislovka-Kotlarovka and down to the southern part of Stepovo-Novosilovka, but that attack was also repelled by the Ukrainians' FPV drone operators. The Russians suffered losses, were forced to fall back. Of course, we understand the Russian plans, what the Russians are planning to do, and according to my understanding, it's just a matter of time when the Russians are going to capture the village and the price they're going to pay for this. And most likely the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back further to the west in direction of Pischana. This is very important target for the Russians, because if you take a look at map, you're gonna see that if the Russians are able to capture this territory, then there is almost no settlements, no villages, nothing that Ukrainians can use for some temporary positions, for some strongholds or shelters for the next 7 kilometers, even more. So if we calculate, for example, the distance between Stepovo-Novosilovka and the first buildings in the village by the name of Pershatravneva, the distance is around 8 kilometers. So 8 kilometers of empty fields without any support, any supply, and this is like a buffer zone. This is like a buffer zone because neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians can have possibilities to attack each other by passing these significant distances, because either the Russians or Ukrainians would be destroyed as a result of FPV drone strikes of each other. Now we are moving further to the south in direction of Mesazharevka. Today, according to the Russian sources, they managed to establish additional control over additional 3 lines in the fields in the vicinity of Avdiivka. Yet we haven't received even a single geolocation confirmation of that. I'll remind you that during the previous weeks we got reports from different Russian sources that the Russians captured Mesazharevka, that the Russians control Avdiivka, established control over Avdiivka for more than 50%, but since the beginning beginning of all these talks, rumors, or maybe wishful thinkings, we still haven't received anything that confirms this information. Now let's move further to Siever's direction, where we also got significant number of updates. The Russians continue clearing Sporyne with significant number of FPV drone strikes, and in this video we can see a few more strikes with FPV drones on Ukrainian shelters on the strongholds. I don't know why the Russians are so focused in this area without any attempts to attack this territory on the ground. One can say that the village was already reduced to ruins because every single square centimeter of this area was already bombed or attacked by the Russian FPV drone. And telling the truth, we can see the concentration of Russian artillery strikes or even FPV drone strike. The concentration is much higher in comparison even with Vovchansk, where we can see right now the most heaviest clashes ever. So lots of questions about the village, and the most important, why the Russians still haven't captured this territory. Maybe this village is so important for the Ukrainians, so they're sending more and more forces inside of this area, and the Russians are just might grinding them every single day. Mid grinding, okay. Now let's move further in direction of Rasulov. As we discussed in the previous video, the Russians, according to many sources, launched an offensive operation to Rasulov, trying to enter the village from the southwestern direction and trying to enter the village from the southeastern direction. Currently, we don't know for sure whether the Russians managed to achieve some results, get some success or not, but I'll remind you that during the previous week we were talking a lot about significant Russian progress, let's say to the east and south and the northeast of the village by the name of Rasulov. This territory was captured according to different Russian military experts. Of course, from this configuration of the front line, those attacks that the Russians conducted during the previous day are logical, because from this configuration, from this perspective, there are no chances, the Ukrainians have no chances to hold this territory for a very long time. Most likely during the next few days, the Ukrainians will be forced to abandon their positions further to the north in direction of Berezny. Now let's move to Chasiv Yar direction. Yesterday we got significant number of updates and details about the battle for the central part of the eastern Chasiv Yar. We got a lot of videos with flags, we got a lot of videos with Russian stormtroopers. Today we got almost nothing. For example, we got just some updates from different mappers, including Deep State. According to Deep State, the Russians established control over more than, let's say, 50% of the eastern Chasiv Yar. The rest, 45%, are in the gray zone and just 5% under Ukraine control. Today, as we discussed, no videos, just reports, just posts from Telegram channels and Twitter channels that the Russians were trying to check and to test Ukrainian defense in the, let's say, western citadel that located in the eastern part of Vovchansk. We have 100% sure information that this territory still remains under Ukraine control, but most likely during the next few days or even during the next week, the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back to the Ukrainian side of Seversky Donetsk-Donbass River. From this direction, during the previous day, we got just one geolocation. In this video, we can see the movements of Russian stormtroopers from one building to another, and in let's say after a few seconds of the video, we can see how the Ukrainians started bombing the Russian soldiers. We still haven't received any clarifications about the situation in the vicinity of the village. Kalinovka, just artillery strikes from the Russian side, artillery strikes from the Ukrainian side, and for now it's still very difficult to understand where exactly are the Russian positions and where exactly are the Ukrainian positions. We haven't received anything about Klishchiivka, but as I understand, now the Russians are mainly focused in the area of Chasiv Yar. Now let's move to Avdiivka area. As for Sokol, during the previous day, we haven't received anything about this village. If you remember yesterday, there was a very interesting meeting between Ukrainian Bradley and Russian BTR. Currently, according to those videos, we can make a conclusion that both vehicles were destroyed as a result of fire of each other. But today we haven't received anything from this direction, just few old footages, old videos of how the Russians were FPV droning joining the Ukrainians. The most important updates from these direction are coming from the area of the village by the name of Omansa. So as you can see, we have adjusted the map. If you remember the previous configuration of the front line, you would mention that we have adjusted the map significantly. We've colored in red color, the color of Russian control, the fields to the north of Omanska. These fields, we colored the, let's say, fields to the west of Semyonovka, so significant progress, and we've colored the territory based on two geolocations. This is the first geolocation, and this is the second geolocation that were published by the Ukrainian forces. On these videos, on the series of videos, we can see the work of Ukraine FPV drone operators, of how they were FPV droning the Russians all over the entire territory of Ukraine, and two geolocations, two videos were located exactly in these 2 points. So very interesting things. Let's discuss this area. As you can see, the Russians are moving closer and closer in direction of Novoselovka Pershe and Novopokrovska. First of all, the Russians are concentrated in maintaining the gray zone, in forcing the Ukrainians to fall back from the fields in direction of towards Novoselovka Pershe, Novopokrovska. So when talking about this part, there is nothing special, just a regular military routine. The Russians were capturing the fields and tree lines in the fortifications. The Ukrainians were abandoning their positions. The most important videos, the most important geolocation is coming from this line. As you can see, there is a water barrier by the name of Balka Babaki. And this small river probably was crossed by the Russians according to geolocation, and the Russians started moving along this tree line further to the north. So this is of course significant progress, and most likely that attack was unexpected, because this attack can ruin the Ukrainian plans and can ruin the entire Ukrainian defense belt. So now the Ukrainians of course discovered the Russian movements and started FPV droning the Russians. Now the Russians are trying to dig in deeper along this tree line. The Russians will try to get, let's say, to the most northern part of the tree line, and after that, most likely, the Russians will try to improve their positions and to establish complete control over this territory. And if the Russians are able to do this, this can lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense belt on this direction, because from this territory, the Russians have significant number of options of where to go next. The Russians can attack from this foothold to the south, trying to cut the Ukrainian positions in Yasnobrodovka, because as I understand, the Ukrainians still have possibilities to get some supply and support on faced by soldiers, let's say from Yasnobrodovka on the line between Yasnobrodovka and the village, let's say, of Skuchne. So this probably the supply road that Ukrainians still have possibility to use, and if the Russians are already here, now they can move further to the west and the southwest and to capture this stronghold, and Ukrainians in Yasnobrodovka would be encircled. Of course, the Ukrainians would not be encircled. Most likely, they, as soon as they understand, as soon as they found out the situation, most likely they're about to make a decision to decide to fall back from Yasnobrodovka further to the west in direction of Karlovka. So most likely this is exactly what is going to happen. Furthermore, we have a very strong defense belt of the armored forces of Ukraine among the fields between Novopokrovska, let's say Novoselovka Pershe, and this Balka Babaika. So this is Babaki. This is a very powerful stronghold. This stronghold is located very close to Novoselovka Pershe. This area is under responsibilities of 25th Airborne Brigade, of 61st Mechanized Brigade, of 68th Jaeger, of 47. So significant number of brigades that have, let's say, Western weapon in their, let's say, use. And now we see that the Russians can attack this stronghold, this defense belt from behind, and of course this can lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense, and they will be forced to fall back to Novoselovka Pershe. And now the Russians, let's say, that are moving from Semyonovka can capture this territory without any resistance or without any, let's say, barriers from the Ukrainian side. So very complicated situation for the Ukrainians, and we see that most likely the destiny and the future of this direction has been already resolved, and very soon the Russians will capture this entire foothold. Now let's move further to the south in direction of Krasnogorovka. We have a lot of very interesting geolocations and updates. Today, the Ukrainian sources published another video of another massive total tank attacks. So the Russians were using significant number of tanks, completely armored with significant level of additional armor and many other different features. The Ukrainians were trying to slow down and to stop the Russians with FPV drones. The Russians were let's say launching smoke screens. The Russians were using electronic warfare equipment. The Russians landed their infantry in the area, and of course the Russians improved their positions in Krasnogorovka itself. So we have two geolocations, two areas of geolocations that confirms additional Russian progress. And the most important update is coming from the railways that goes from Krasnogorovka to Khostre. So according to geolocation we can take a look at this geolocation once again. So this is it. Just in a second, let's wait a little bit. The Russians are moving, the Russian tanks, many armored vehicles. This is it. So as you can see, this is the railways. These are the railways, and this is the Russian tank that was attacked by Ukraine FPV drone. And that video was geolocated here. So the video was geolocated here, but the Ukrainians didn't show us that the tank was destroyed. So very likely the tank moved further with infantry and probably the personnel. So we don't know for sure where exactly the Russians stopped, which line, which tree line, which fortification or stronghold the Russians managed to reach, but we see the direction of Russian movements. And based on that video, based on that geolocation, we can make a conclusion that the situation of the armored forces of Ukraine that located in the fields between Krasnogorovka, Mariinka and Georgievka became critical. And now the Ukrainians need to decide what to do next, because if the Russians are able to move further to the west, by these attacks, by this, let's say, movement, by this advance, by this progress, the Russians can establish complete fire control over the main supply roads that goes from Gostre, Maximilianovka to these fields, and the Ukrainians who are currently located in among these fields might be encircled by the Russians. So very important progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation, and according to this progress, we can see that the Ukrainian defense belt on the verge of complete collapse. Now let's move to Krasnogorovka itself. We have significant number of geolocations from the western and the northwestern part of the town. We have geolocations that were published by the Ukrainians. We will not watch the videos due to losses and due to casualties and violence in the videos. But according to those geolocations, the Ukrainian FPV drones were FPV droning the Russians along Sumskaya Street, and according to those videos, the Russians captured this high-rise area. So as we can see, based on the geolocations and reports we got during the previous days, the Russians are trying to move in the western and the northwestern direction of the town, trying to avoid any clashes, any, let's say, activity in the area of this high-rise area building. So this is Krasnogorovka stronghold. We call this area Krasnogorovka stronghold. And as I understand, let's say in comparison with, let's say, with Vovchansk stronghold, the Russians have chances how to avoid, they have ways how to avoid the battle for this high-rise building area. The Russians can't avoid battle for the Vovchansk stronghold, but the Russians can do this in this direction. So if the Russians are able to move further and to improve their positions, let's say for additional 200-500 meters, let's say something like this, this will sooner or later force the Ukrainians to start withdrawing their positions and to start abandoning their positions in direction of Schmitta Street. And probably this is going to happen very soon. Furthermore, we should expect some activization or some intensifying of activity from the Russian side on this area as well, because the Russians will try to encircle the Ukrainians, and to do this, first of all, they need to restore or renew their attempts to attack in direction of the central, let's say, hospital. Now let's move further in the southern direction. We have significant number of updates from Konstantinovka, Novomikhailivka area. Just take a look on the map and you're gonna see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 geolocations just from South Donetsk direction. Of course, we got significant number of videos of work of Russian artillery systems. During the previous 24 hours, we got another batch of videos of significant number of artillery systems, ammo depots, and temporary point positions of the armed forces of Ukraine that were destroyed as a result of Russian artillery fire. So the Russian 238th Artillery Brigade probably is heroic brigade when talking about the level of damage they managed to deal to the Ukrainian artillery forces in this area. And all these videos confirms that after a very short regrouping, the Russians are about to renew their offensive or to continue their offensive towards Constantinovka. But let's say in the case of geolocations and possible Russian movements, I believe that the next days the Russians will try to attack along this line, as we discussed in the previous videos. Furthermore, we have some geolocations from the deep state map, and according to them, the Russians established complete control over these fields. Yet we haven't received any geolocations confirming this, but most likely this is exactly like the situation is exactly as described by deep state. And we have toss flamethrower strikes, let's say, among the fields. It's very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold this territory without problems with supply, reinforcements, and support, without absence of any counter-artillery duels, because the Russians basically suppressed everything from their side. So that's why very likely that the fields between Konstantinovka and let's say Vadiana, I'm talking about these fields, would be captured by the Russians in a very near future. Furthermore, most likely the fields between, let's say, Konstantinovka, Solotka, and Mykoiska would be captured by the Russians also very soon, and probably during the next few weeks. And if the Russians are able to take under control these gray zones, these, let's say, white clouds, this is going to be a disaster for the Ukrainians and complete collapse and complete defeat of the Ukrainians on this direction. Now let's move further to the west in direction of Vremivka tactical bridgehead. We don't have lots of interesting updates, just artillery strikes, just toss flamethrower strikes, just FAB arrives and so on. And as you can see, the Russians on Vremivka tactical bridgehead were not bombing Makar, so they were not bombing the settlements. Mainly the Russians were bombing the tree lines, because the tree lines in the fields are located on the hills, on the high-rise area. So as we discussed during the previous videos, the Russians currently are trying to attack in direction of Rovnopol. So according to my understanding of the situation, this is the next goal, the next target of the armed forces of Russian Federation, to capture the hills, to capture the strongholds that are located, let's say, to the west of Mokry Yali River. So if the Russians are able to capture this territory, then from these hills it's going to be not a very big problem for them to capture and to basically establish complete fire control over Starozhovo, Makarovka, and many other settlements. Urozhaine, let's say, concerning Urozhaine, we have a few videos of toss flamethrower strikes in the central part, which also most likely tell us that the Russians are about to begin or renew offensive in this direction as well. As of Rabotina, we haven't received lots of updates, just regular activity around the village itself. And let's say concerning Kherson direction, as you can see, just a small activity from the Russian side of FPV drones. Not small, more precisely, we have lots of FPV drone strikes from the Russian side in the village of Tyaginka. Some ammo depots, some positions, some buildings were under very heavy fire by the Russian FPV drones. Lost some explosions, some equipment was damaged, some warehouses were destroyed. So just regular military activity. And this is the area that Ukrainians use for concentration of forces before further attempts to cross Dnieper River and to land infantry in Krinky. And the same story we can see in the southern part of Kherson. Some FPV drone strikes in Stanislav, additional FPV drone strikes in Dniprovska. So just regular FPV drone activity from the Russian side, and almost no resistance from the Ukrainian side. We got very important updates from the Black Sea. According to Ukrainian sources, the Russians moved their fleet to the Black Sea. One caliber carrier and some ships of support, and the Russians moved 3 caliber carriers to Azov Sea. So according to this piece of news, we can make a conclusion that during the upcoming night, the Russians are planning to start massive missile strike all over the entire territory of Ukraine with calibers, with of different series, including Kinzhals and many other missiles and so on. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds that we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.